The Consulting Success podcast is powered by the Clarity Coaching Program. If you'd like to work directly with the Consulting Success team and receive personal coaching and support to optimize and grow your consulting business, marketing, and revenue, visit consultingsuccess.com to find out more and apply.
Welcome to the Consulting Success Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Zapersky. In this podcast, we'll dive deep into the world of elite consultants, where you'll learn the strategies, tactics, and mindset to grow a highly profitable and successful consulting business.
Hey everyone, it's Michael Zapersky here, and today I'm with Mike Adams. Mike, welcome.
Thanks very much, Michael.
So Mike, you're the head of story-powered sales at Anecdote, a consulting and coaching kind of training business that helps organizations leverage the power of storytelling. And your client list includes very well-known brands like IBM and Shell and KPMG and many others. Previously, you led sales teams for companies all around the world like Nokia, Spotless, Motorola, and others. You're also the author of 7 stories every salesperson must tell. And so we are going to get into a lot about story here because, as I mentioned to you before we hit the record button, this is such a powerful area that I personally feel and also have observed over the years that most consultants don't do much with, don't really know much about it. And we certainly were, I'd say, guilty of this for many years, where we just either hesitated intentionally to not tell our story, or we didn't know how. And so we didn't. And only over the last few years have we really started to become more intentional and to embrace the power of storytelling. So excited to have you on here today, Mike. And let's begin with, how do people tell their story? What should someone know when they're thinking about storytelling?
Well, the first thing to know, and thanks very much for that introduction, Michael. That was nice to listen to. The first thing to know about story is, don't just think storytelling. There's much more to story than storytelling. In fact, I work for a company called Anecdote. We've been doing this since 2004. And the company was founded by Sean Callahan, and he had been working for IBM before he set out on his own. And he had been doing story seeking, collecting stories as part of a culture change project for IBM. So he was flying around all the locations and collecting stories about how things really are done, rather than how the CEO or the C-level might think things should be done. And that's a very powerful way to understand culture and to start thinking about how you might change the way people behave in your company. And after a couple of years, some of his clients said, Sean, you seem very good at story. Would you teach our people how to tell stories? And he said, no, we're not doing that, because that's just too open to manipulation. And that he thought about it a bit more, and he thought, well, if we teach companies how to find specific true stories from their organization and tell those just as anecdotes, which is why our company is called Anecdote, nothing Hollywood about it, just little 1-2 minute anecdotes, then that would be quite okay. In 2006, we released Storytelling for Leaders, which has been delivered to thousands of companies and tens of thousands of people all over the world. And now we have Storytelling for Sales Teams, which is called Story Powered Sales, and for strategy communication, Story Powered Strategy. So think story work rather than storytelling. But we say in Anecdote that you need to tell a story to get a story. So it starts by telling a story so that the other person will tell you a story back. And I guess your listeners have probably all experienced those wonderful prospect meetings where you seem to be really drawn in, and the client is sharing with you everything that's going on. And what's generally happening when you have those wonderful first meetings is they're sharing stories with you about how things are really happening. They've decided to trust you for whatever reason, which we should get into. They've decided to trust you, and they're sharing with you what's happening in the form of stories. They're telling you examples of what's happened. So that's probably a little introduction to story work. When Sean and Mark, my colleagues in Anecdote, started, they said that you couldn't really say the word story because people thought it was just making stuff up or fairy tales or children's stuff, wasn't businesslike. There's been a real switch. Now people talk a lot about story, but we notice they often don't know what a story is when they say the word story. So we have kind of the opposite problem now, in the sense that the word story seems to be accepted, but good examples of people telling stories are kind of rare. In fact, a colleague of mine, actually one of my clients, sent me a paper from a well-known global consulting company that shall remain nameless. And the topic was the importance of storytelling in technical sales. It was 11 pages, beautifully written, nice graphic graphs, not a single story in the whole document. And that kind of illustrates the problem. People talk story, but they don't tell story. So I've just told you a story about the foundation of anecdote, which we could call a company story. And I've also told you a story to make a point that we often say story and don't know what a story is.
So let me ask you about that, Mike, for a moment, because I definitely want to get into something that, they'll be very tangible and that people can actually apply. But before we do that, why do you think people don't more proactively seek stories or tell their stories? I mean, every single one of us has stories inside of us. Every single person in our community that I have interacted with, or, I'd say the vast majority, even that I have not directly interacted with, they're very good at what they do. I mean, they're experts in their areas. They can achieve results and deliver value for their clients. So they don't come to us, looking for help with their skill set. It's more about the business side of how to build a successful consulting business. Yet those same people who are clearly very good at what they do, have a track record of success, often don't tell their story. They're not even thinking about that. Why do you think that is?
I think there's a few reasons, but probably the main reason is that there's a fashion. I'll just call it that. There's a fashion in how we should speak in business, and we should talk in abstract terms. And that seems to be like the way to talk in business. So we should say things like customer service is our number one priority. It sounds good. And who's going to argue? But what the hell does it mean? And if I say to you, well, I agree with you, I think customer service should be your number one priority, but could you give me an example of excellent customer service? That's a story-seeking question which would take you to some understanding. So when we speak abstractly, we say those kind of opinions, statements, we kind of float along the surface with I would call it a veneer of understanding. We think we understand each other and we really don't. And when we get down to the level of sharing specific examples, which is all a story is something that actually happened. True stories are something that actually happened in a time and place with people that was meaningful and then for which we can get meaning. That's all they are. And when we consciously decide to share stories, we find ourselves much better understood. And when we consciously decide to seek out stories, we'll find that we actually understand our clients a hell of a lot better. And I have some interesting, when we teach storytelling with some really interesting examples of how salespeople and consultants can really understand what's going on by seeking out the client's story, which is really about asking a different kind of question. Behind me is a bunch of sales books, so people listening won't be able to see that, but the ones watching can. And the vast majority of sales training or consulting training, how to consult, they're about asking questions. They're, ask this type of question, ask that type of question, ask this type of question. And the underlying assumption is that by playing the doctor role, diagnosing and trying to figure out, what goes on through questions, we will be able to understand the client's problem so that we can fix it. And my view is that that's not a useful approach to really understanding what's going on. And if you ask the classic question types in sales training books, you will very often miss what's really going on. That's because we tend to focus on why, what, and how kind of questions. But story-seeking questions are when and where. When did you see that working well? Where were you when you noticed that was a problem? Tell me what happened. We're trying to get down to the level of specific examples of what happened. Those questions are not taught in sales training books mostly, but they get you a true understanding of what's going on.
And so let's now move forward with the assumption, Mike, that the listener is going, okay, that makes sense. I can buy into that I need to tell stories and maybe I want to go and now actively seek stories. So what's your suggestion? How should somebody who wants to tell more stories, where should they start? Should they look internal into, to find their own stories? Should they go out and seek stories from their clients, past, present perspective? What is the best place for somebody to begin this journey?
Well, I guess most of your listeners read books. It's my experience that consultants do read. That's not my experience with salespeople, by the way. Just joking. Some of them read. And there are some excellent books. I wrote one. Mike Bosworth wrote an excellent book on storytelling for consulting and sales. It's called What Great Salespeople Do, written in 2012. My book's called 7 Stories Every Salesperson Must Tell, but it's equally applicable for consulting. And my book takes you through a buyer-seller process from first meeting, why should they trust you? Why should they even talk to you? To why should you change? Because consulting is about positioning a change agenda.
So let me actually just stop you there for a moment, Mike, because I want to really make this tangible for everyone. Let's just talk about that. I mean, you mentioned even earlier on, right, the importance of being able to establish trust in that relationship, right, and even get kind of a seat at the table. So how would you use, or how are you at your company currently using storytelling to connect with prospective buyers and to increase the level of trust? Maybe could you offer a quick story or an example of what that might look like?
Yeah, I can. So we teach what we call a sales connection story, which is a story about something that's happened to you that demonstrates your credibility and explains to your buyer why you do what you do. I tell that various ways depending on who I'm meeting. But say I was meeting a CEO who had a sales team, and depending on how much time I have, but I would say something like, look, I'm an engineer by training, so storytelling didn't really come naturally to me. But I had this job of doing a 1-hour software demonstration more than 20 years ago. I was running a marketing team for a big software company. And I thought, like, 1 hour is way too long to demonstrate software. I have to be more interesting than that. And I had this idea of writing a play. And I wrote a play for my marketing team. They didn't really like the idea very much. And they got up and acted out this play of how our software could be used. And there was a remarkable response from the audience. They kept asking questions to my guys who stayed in role for an hour or so afterwards. And I realized then that the story of how you use the software was much more interesting than the features and benefits of the software. But it wasn't until a few years later when I told a really short story when I was working in Russia and heard some of my clients telling my story back to me that I realized the story was kind of traveling. It was doing work. We call it, story was doing work. And then I had a career running sales teams, big sales teams in various multinational companies. And when I decided to stop doing that for various emotional reasons, 2015, I thought about solving the problem of how to help salespeople connect properly and say the right thing in all those meetings where I was trying to kick them under the table. And so I started teaching salespeople how to do that. And when I went back to figure out what they remembered, noticed that they only remembered the storytelling part of what I was teaching, didn't remember any of the other stuff. So I switched to just teaching storytelling and using storytelling as the primary instruction method, but also teaching them how to tell stories. So that's how I got into it. So that's an example of a connection story. You probably infer some things about me that I didn't say about myself. I didn't say that I've worked in different countries for big I mentioned it in the story. I work for multinational companies and I have run sales teams, but you infer things about me from the way I told that story.
While we work with a lot of seasoned and experienced consultants here at Consulting Success, I'm often contacted by new early stage consultants. Invariably, the question I'm asked is, what are the steps I should take to become a successful consultant and grow my consulting business to my first 6 figures per year? Well, I'm excited to announce that we've opened the doors for our Momentum program. This is our most popular program for early stage consultants, and it has helped almost 1,000 consultants to start, run, and grow successful consulting businesses. It gives you the step-by-step plan to help you with your messaging, your fees, and pricing strategies, how to win more proposals, how to go to market more effectively, developing a marketing system to generate leads consistently, and so much more. And right now, until September the 19th, you can sign up for Momentum and get 50% off the regular price by going to consultingsuccess.com/audio. That's consultingsuccess.com/audio, AUDIO. Only 100 spots are available to join Momentum and get 50% off. This deal is only available until September the 19th or until all 100 spots are gone. We won't be opening up new spots in this program for several months, so don't wait. Go to consultingsuccess.com/audio. That's consultingsuccess.com/audio, AUDIO.
Can you use this story? I mean, have you seen it effectively used even before you're speaking one-to-one with the buyer. So let's say you're on a Zoom call or you're meeting in person, depending on what the situation is with the world at that time. But if you were, let's say, you're still wanting to build your pipeline, you want to even get the meeting, can story be used before you actually have a conversation one-to-one? And if so, can you maybe just offer a quick example or two of how you guys are doing that, or others have done that with effectiveness?
Yes. So sometimes you have to create curiosity in a very short space of time, maybe within the subject line of an email, for example, which is too short for a story. The way I look at that is I'll think about the story that would resonate with that prospect. And I'm thinking about success stories in that case, usually other clients like them that have succeeded with storytelling that we teach. And I will tell either the beginning or the end of a specific story. So, for example, we work with the big Italian insurance company, Generali, and the head of distribution, the lady there called Rebecca, she told me when she took the job on and listened to her salespeople talking, they sounded like talking brochures. And she knew she had to change that. So I would use that in a subject line to see if I can hook. Do you have the problem of your salespeople sounding like talking brochures? And then in the body, I would say, well, we work with Generali. And then I still wouldn't complete the story because unfinished stories are curious. How did that go? How did you do that is the question. So if someone else has that problem, that story, I call that a half a story. The half story that you would like to hear the end of becomes the hook. And you can also put the half story at the end, which would be, this was the result that we got with Generali. Would you like to hear how it started? And that's also curious. So I think about the story that would resonate and work out what to partially tell.
So it sounds like you're almost, if we kind of like reverse engineer that a little bit, you're identifying the problem or the goal, the desire that a client has, right? That you've been part of, experience, it's a past situation. And then you're using that then to create a story around it. So if you identify, here was the result or here was the problem that they had, then you're thinking, well, what was the situation, the environment, the story around that? And that's what you're then extracting and then using to put out into the world, whether it's in an email, in a presentation, website copy, or also when you sit down with a buyer one-to-one. Is that correct? Am I missing anything?
Yeah, that's correct. But I'm trying not to make it too abstract. I would actually use the quotation marks, my salespeople sound like talking brochures, and put in that partial story. So it's a specific example still, rather than be abstract. And, prospecting for new clients is never a certain thing because you're reaching out to people who may or may not have that problem. You're trying to be intelligent about that. You're trying to be intelligent about, who else is probably experiencing the same sort of issue and target them in that way. But the story is more engaging than an abstract laying out of the problem, which would be like more typical business approach.
What have you found is, if somebody wants to improve and get better at telling these stories, in your own experience, Mike, when you look back over the years of developing, your expertise in this area, is there one or a couple of things that you've done that you think have played the biggest role in increasing your understanding and the success that you've been able to achieve? Like, as an example, is it focusing on how you write? Or is it focusing on, really trying to identify anytime you hear a story or see a story and noting it down? Like, is there anything that you've done that's helped you to really increase your performance in this area?
Absolutely. And there are specific things that are meta skills when we teach this. And the first one is knowing exactly what a story is and what it isn't. And for that, you need to be able to recognize certain specific elements of story. The first being time and place. They happen at a time and a place, and there is a sequence of related events. They kind of go, you can think of them in terms of conjunctions, actually. They go like, at this time and place, something, and, but. And the but is the thing you don't expect. Oh, now what's happening? They are a promise of something that's unanticipated, a surprise. And then they finish so. And, but, so. And whenever you're delivering your information about what happened in that sequence, you're telling a story. And People will listen. The people will find that interesting. There's an engaging aspect to that. And there's a very simple reason why stories are engaging. What we know that we can't predict. We know that stories have an unpredictable element to them, and we want to try and predict what's going to happen next. We have this big part of our brain which is doing nothing but predicting all of its inputs. The neocortex is predicting its inputs. So it's trying to predict what you're going to see next, what you're going to hear next, and what you're going to feel. And your neocortex would have been predicting, I was going to say the word next. So stories, even though you hear them or you read them, if they have a character in them, the listener can put themselves into the story and imagine themselves as that person and try to predict what's going to happen next to that person and how that person will feel. And that's the way we pass emotional content in stories. And your listeners may or may not know, but humans make all their decisions, every single one, by reference to our emotional memory, which is in the neocortex, by the way. So a decision, by definition, is a decision to feel comfortable on some timescale. It's a feeling. I will do that if I feel that I'll be more comfortable in the near, mid, long term. And we predict how we'll feel before we move, before we act. And so stories are a wonderful mechanism, because when we tell stories about other people who are in the process of acting, we can infer how that person feels and why they're acting. So we're passing emotional reasoning as well as rational reasoning in a story, which is a crucial thing to understand about decision making.
One thing, Mike, we've observed ourselves and have found to be very helpful in sales, in enrollments and speaking with clients, and it's something that we also teach and kind of coach our clients, especially in our Clarity coaching program around, is this idea of trying to capture different use cases or situations that the buyer is in. And so, as an example, if you can say to someone, yeah, no, I totally understand, like what you shared, that's very interesting. Thanks for sharing that. We were, working with a client recently in this industry, blah, 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 blah. They also thought the same thing. They had plans to go down that path, right? And then this is what you were kind of saying before. But, what they ended up doing was this different thing because of these reasons. And so, right, they saw this result. Like it sounds like that kind of approach is very similar to the formula that you have. Obviously, yours is much better documented than ours, or the approach that we've probably assembled from many different people. Is there anything else like to that? Can you add maybe a little bit more detail, or what are some guidance for people?
So we talked about connection stories, like what could I tell you about myself that would infer credibility and trust, that you would trust me. So that the main character in that story is yourself. You're talking about something that happened to you. And now you're talking about, people will say case study, a case of a client that we helped. The classic case study in 3 parts is problematic for storytelling, because it starts off like this. I'll paraphrase. Here is our other client in the shit. We came in and fixed it, and now everything's great. And I put that deliberately like that because there's a problem there. And the problem is the hero of the story is us. And a lot of consultants make themselves the hero in their consulting success stories, their case studies. And the problem with that is that your listener does not identify with you, the consultants. They identify with that other poor, helpless, hopeless person that you just made look bad. So there is a formula to telling a success story that will really resonate with your prospect.
Give us the formula there, Mike. Let's get into it. Yeah.
Formula is coming on. So we can't do it in 3 parts. We need a few more parts. So the formula starts with, tell us about that other client. What kind of business are they? Where are they? You don't have to name them. You can just say something, we'll call him Fred, whatever. But start with them. Don't say, I had a client or we had a client. If you start with the pronoun I or we, you're already likely to tell it from your own perspective. So here's Fred in this situation, getting a problem. And then Fred is lucky. He meets a guide. He meets you. How did he meet you? It's always an interesting part of the story. How did you come into this story? Was there a competitive tender? Did they find you on the website? Did someone refer you? Very often, actually, people don't know. You have to go and find out. You have to go and ask, what made you even think to contact me in the first place? And then you talk about a mutual plan. We sat down, we worked out a plan together. So now your other client has agency. And then we talk about all the things that they didn't want to happen. What were the concerns with that plan? What were the objections? What were the things that would make that not a good idea? Lay that out in terms of failure possibility and then talk about success. The success not of your company, the actual success that your client received, both personal and business. And when you do it that way, I mean, you also realize very often that you don't know exactly what that success was. You have to go back and ask them. So to tell a good success story means going back and interviewing that client who succeeded and being able to answer that in those phrases. So what was their situation before they contacted you? How was the problem impacting them? How did they feel about it? And what was the consequence? How did they meet you exactly and why? What was the mutual plan? Usually, you know what that was. What were they concerned about? And then what is their success now? What's it really meant for them? And when you have that conversation, you come up with a very nice success story. Usually you always learn something interesting when you have that conversation with past clients.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And for anyone that's driving or running right now and can't capture all that, make sure to head over to consultingsuccess.com. There's the podcast page. We'll have the show notes there with this. I want to thank you, Mike, for coming on here today. And this is such a deep topic that we could, I know, literally spend, hours, and if not days, going through. So where would be the best place for people to go to learn more about you, your work, your book? Just kind of tell us the best place for people to go.
I will, but I will just make one more point, which I think is important. And that is, I talked at the beginning that it's story work, not storytelling. So when you tell a sales connection story, something about yourself, end it with enough about me, what about you? And you'll get back a story from the other person rather than this sort of abstract. They'll tell you how they got into their job as well. It's a remarkable trick. And when you tell a story about one of your other clients that succeeded, end that with, well, enough about them. How's things going on here? And they will tell you the story about how things are going on. So I mentioned that we tell stories to get stories. And this changes the tone of your conversations. You become less of the high-powered authority that can come in and fix things to more of a problem solver and someone that can engage and solve problems on a level. And you'll really hear what's happening with your clients, and they will appreciate that. So you can get my book by typing Mike Adams 7 Stories into your favorite search engine, and there's audiobook and all sorts of books on various online repositories. You could also have a look at anecdote.com. Huge number of stories there. There's a story bank. You can search for all kinds of different stories there. And there's a YouTube channel. If you put Story Powered Sales into YouTube, we have a YouTube channel with a bunch of stories so people can see all the different types of stories in action.
Fantastic. Well, I want to encourage everyone to dive deeper into those resources. And again, we'll have all that linked up in the show notes. I really, feel stories are just so incredibly powerful, Mike. And I know I've certainly been encouraging many clients to dive deeper into this topic because we ourselves, as I mentioned earlier on, probably, we neglected it. We didn't really think too much about it. And just kind of coming back to my early days, I think for quite some time, I didn't really want to tell my story because I thought I need to always be professional, right? I always need to kind of have that image and not really talk about myself or my experiences or my vulnerabilities or, those sorts of things. But once we start to open up and tell more of our story, what we found is not only was that enjoyable, but we started to also attract people who resonated with those stories. So again, this is a topic that we could go on for hours and hours about, but just to add that our experience has certainly been we've been able to bring more of the right kind of people from our community, into the world where we can work together and collaborate and create, some magical results and so forth. But yes, so thank you, Mike, so much for coming on. And I hope that everyone takes some time to think about what are your stories and how can you tell your stories. And I love the point that you made about, telling stories to get stories, because I think everyone enjoys a good story, or at least it gets their attention, their interest. And consulting is about asking great questions. So what a powerful way to elicit and to extract, great valuable information from buyers or from the market that you want to serve, than by leading with a story to open things up. So I think that's a really wonderful tip. So Mike, thank you again so much for coming on.
It was a pleasure. Thanks very much, Michael.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Consulting Success Podcast. For more episodes and to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, head on over to iTunes. And if you'd like to develop consistent lead flow and a highly profitable consulting business, learn more about our coaching programs at consultingsuccess.com.